Hi everybody, my name is Jens Larsen. In this video I'm going to take a look at the well-known standard All the Things You Are. I think All the Things You Are is a song that pretty much everybody needs to know. It's a very common tune and it's probably played on sessions all over the world. So it's of course also an obvious choice if you want to learn how to analyze harmony and dig a little bit deeper into what is really going on when the chords are changing. So what I'm going to do in this video is that I'm going to take the song and then first try to analyze the form. I think it's better to just first figure out how is the form of the song, how is it constructed, and then go a little bit deeper and look at the individual chords and the individual key centers because it modulates a few times. And then from there we can of course take a look at how the chords are moving and what scales are used on the chords, how does it relate to the melody, and of course also look a little bit at like how does a song modulate, because it is a song that modulates a lot more than the most standards really. So it's also a good example of how there are some really nice modulations happening. And that's of course also important if you want to use that in your own arrangements or compositions. And then I'm also just going to talk a little bit about the different scales and how the harmony works, so you have an idea about what kind of scales you need to use if you're in a key and you come across this type of chord. If you want to learn more about jazz guitar, improve the way that you solo, check out some interesting arpeggios or chord voicings, then subscribe to my channel. If you want to make sure not to miss anything, then click the little bell notification icon next to the subscribe button. For this video I'm going to use this screen capture setup, which I'm not so used to using, so it might be a bit messy at times. I might shake the camera a little bit because the camera's on my table. I think I said something similar in the Stella by Starlight video. The first thing we need to look at is the form of All the Things You Are. So if we look at the key of the piece, the ending of All the Things You Are is a cadence to A flat, and the final note in the melody is an A flat. So in this case the song is in the key of A flat major, and that's of course sort of going to be the foundation of everything that we're going to understand about the song, even if it does modulate, is that it actually starts kind of it starts in A flat and it ends in A flat. And to understand the form, so the first 8 bars, because I think the form is an AABA, even though it's a little bit unclear compared to other AABAs, it's not as clear as if you took something like What Is This Thing Called Love, which is really clearly just identical forms throughout, and then just having really only an A part and a bridge part, the same for Take the A Train. But here stuff is happening, but it is still AABA, so I think the easiest way to figure that out is really by looking at the melody. And I think it's also important to realize that the most important thing about about a standard is the melody. And you can do all sorts of stuff with the changes, but the melody is going to stay the same. So that's what you want to know. That's the core of everything that's happening, and from there you can go into what chords are under it. So if we look at or listen to the first part of the melody, so the first 8 bars. So we have the first part of the melody that's really in the key of A flat and it ends in C major. And then this idea is repeated with a slight variation in the melody. Like this, and that means that we have really the same harmony and we have pretty much the same melody. It's just in another key. So we still get another A part, but it's moved up from A flat to E flat. And then from there it moves to G major. So, and that's of course the bridge. And then quickly also moving to E major. And from there, so that's the whole bridge is really just these 2 cadences. Moving back to the original melody and the last A part, starting up completely the same. But once it gets to the 4th degree here, then we get a variation. So we move, so there's this tag to it where it's just extended, and then we get the ending of the song. So that's just from the melody understanding the form, and I think it's just important to have this idea that okay, it is AABA, but the first 2 A parts are in different keys, even though they're pretty similar. Then we get the bridge, and then we get a last A that is extended and has 4 extra bars. With this layout, then we can also start looking at just analyzing the first A part, because that's already going to say really a lot about what is happening in the second A part. And also in the last A part. So of course the key here is A flat, so let's write that like this, A flat. And sorry for my horrible handwriting, that's just the way it is. And then we start on the 6th degree, because F minor is of course the 6th degree in A flat. Then we just get a 2-5-1, so that's fairly simple. And it's also worth noticing here that the melody of All the Things You Are is sort of really strong in the harmony, because it's really a lot of thirds and sevenths that are happening here. So it's very sort of clear and really spelling out where the harmony is. And that also makes the melody so strong that it's kind of easy to hear the modulations in it. So let's use it with 1, and then we get the D flat, that's of course a 4. Here, so now then we get a G7. And in this case, if you're in A flat major, then the G7 is really just the dominant that you would expect to point to the 3rd degree, so to a C minor. So let's just call it that. So that's a secondary dominant. To 3. See if I can write that here. Yeah, it works. And then it turns out that actually this is moving to a new key. And then that it's a G7 that's resolving to C major. So in that case, we're actually going to have a 1 chord here, and this is in C. Could be that it's going to be difficult to see everything that's happening. If you were to only look at my analysis, not while I'm writing, it might be difficult to follow. But in this way, we actually have the first part of the song sort of covered, because we have first this long, really just a circle of fifths within the key, and then we get an extra dominant, and then it moves to the median, the upper median, the C major. And so there are a few things about this. It's very common for songs to actually modulate up to the major third, and that's worth noticing, because if you're aware of that, then you're of course also you're going to have an easier time playing over it. So if you want to think about other songs that do this, then Cole Porter's I Love You does this, I'm Old Fashioned does it, and songs like, what is that called, Gone with the Wind has it as well. So it's a fairly common modulation to have in there. And that's also something that you can expect to come across quite often, and recognize that that's how you play on it. So now we have that covered. And then actually, if we look at the second A part, I'm not really going to go into too much detail with that, because it does completely the same. It just has this neat trick of moving to E flat by using C turning into a C minor for the next chord. And it's again completely clear, because we have the third in the melody. Let's see. So yeah, so that means that we are actually just ending. I'm just going to put that in. We're ending in G major in the second half. And we're actually also starting the bridge in G major. So once it moves to the bridge, then we first just get a 2-5-1 in G major. So that's this. And really the way it then moves on, because the next line in the bridge is moving to E major. But it kind of does that using the same idea as what we had in the A parts, because we get a complete cadence to, well, in this case it's actually a cadence to E minor. So if I write that like this, 2-5, to 6, because this is of course, when you're hearing this, if you imagine that you were hearing this for the first time, then you have the 2-5, and when you're here, you would expect it to be an E minor chord. But actually what it does is it goes to E major. So that's similar to how we were expecting the G7 in the first A part to move to C minor. Now it's moving to E major. And that means that we're just quickly ending up in another key here, which is E major. So that's a 1 chord. And then we have 1 bar to get back to the last A. And the way it actually does that is kind of neat in a way, because really what is happening here is that if you change 1 note in the E major chord, so in this case I'm going to change the 5th to a B flat. So that's really voice leading wise, what's happening is really that's all that's happening. And then we have a C7 altered, and then that's moving us to F minor. So that's one of the few places where, in terms of describing the modulation, I'm going to return to how the modulations work because they're fairly clear here. But this is one of the ones that are a little bit more tricky to describe because it's very quick, and it's also a little bit more surprising, I guess. So in any case we have like a 5, and the question is, if you were to hear this, if you were hearing at this point, now we're in E major, then you would hear this as a sort of dominant of the dominant, so some sort of dominant to C7, to B7, which is of course in the key of E major, I guess. But it moves to from here, so the C7 moves to back to the A, so back to F minor. And that means that then now we're then again in A flat here. So, and really what we get here is of course then the same, so we have the 6 and then a 2-5. And the 1 and the 4, and then we get the extension. So normally, but in the first A part, then it would move to C major. But here we need to finish the song, and the song is not finishing in C major; it's finishing in A flat major, because that's what feels like home. And that means that we get this extension. So I'm just gonna skip those 3 chords and then just say, well, okay, at the end of this, and this is always just good to, whenever you're analyzing a song, if you recognize something, you need to put in what it is, and then you can fill in the gaps along the way. It's also going to make it a lot easier to just sort of fill in the holes that you might have once, because if you have figured out, okay, here we have this, and it's moving from there to there, then that's going to help you figure out what's supposed to be in between and what that chord is actually doing there, if it's unclear. So now we have that one. So that's the one. Now we have 4 here, so it goes to the D flat major 7 here, and then we get the D flat minor. It's written as D flat minor 7 in the real book, and that says a lot about the real book and not about what is really there. I think the best description of this would be a D flat minor 6, or possibly a G flat 7. And if you've seen enough of my videos, you know that that's a 4 minor chord. So really what's happening here is that it goes from 4 to 4 minor. And another thing that I keep repeating in my videos is that 4 minor is a way to go back to the tonic. So then we get a 3, and the 3 is of course also a tonic chord in the key of A flat, or actually in any key. So C minor is a tonic chord in A flat major. So now we have that. Then we have this B diminished. So we have the B flat minor to E flat 7 at the end here. So C minor, and then we get the flat 3 diminished, which is mostly just called that, actually flat 3 diminished. And the strict description of it, theoretically, the way that I used to talk about it, is that that's a sharp 4 diminished, which I also have a video on somewhere. This is actually similar to, also here it's really appearing as a diminished chord, but it's very similar to the first 2 bars of Stellar by Starlight, where we have that there is turned into a 2-5-1. But in this case, it's just the flat 3 diminished. And actually, I didn't want to write it as that. I want to write it as a sharp 4 diminished. And the reason why I want to do that diminished is that sharp 4 can happen in a few different ways. I'm not really going to get into too much of that, but I think the easiest way to understand that chord, at least for me, was always to just think of it as being, if we have A flat to A flat 7 to D flat to D diminished, and that's the sharp 4 diminished sound, and then back to probably A flat, E flat, and then back to A flat. So that's how that chord works. And then in this case we have the sharp 4 diminished, but it's in an inversion. It's with the, well, actually it's with the 7th in the bass, and then it's moving down to the B flat minor. So that's a different kind of resolution, but that's how it works in this key. So it's a subdominant diminished. And I think one thing that's also worth noticing about this chord is that it has the 7th of the scale in the melody, so it has the G in the melody. And if you look at the different melodies that you probably know who has this chord or variations in the chord progression, that it's almost always that melody note. So I mentioned Stellar by Starlight. If I was to play Stellar by Starlight with a flat 3 diminished in A flat, then it would be this. So that's the same melody note. Another one that I usually talk about as an example is I Remember You, and there's the same. So that would start on the 1, and then have the sharp 4 diminished harmonizing the 7th, so the leading note in the key. And you could also say that it's a nicer way to harmonize that note than the other option you kind of have would be to harmonize it as a dominant chord. But you can also hear that's a little bit obvious. So having the 3rd in the melody on a dominant chord is maybe not that nice sometimes. So that's why you will find that they'll use a diminished chord also. So if we look at how the song moves in terms of the different keys that it's in, it starts in A flat major, and then it moves to C major, and then sort of just by hinting at going to C minor, it moves to E flat major. From there it moves in a similar way to G major, and then it stays in G major in the beginning of the bridge. Then it moves to E major, and from there it moves back to A flat and basically stays there. So those are the key centers. If we look at the different modulations, I think there are a few different ways that the song modulates. The important thing about understanding a modulation, at least in a song like this, is to realize that there's going to be a chord that's going to be the pivot chord. So if you're going from one key to the next key, then there's going to be one chord that kind of works for both of them, that you will come across that will make sense in both keys. And if we take the first modulation here, where we're going from A flat to C major, then there are actually 2 different options where you could place that chord and how you want to think about it. The one that I took now was the G7. So as I said, when I analyzed this, the G7 is something that we understand in A flat because it's the chord that we would expect to take us to C minor. So that's the chord that takes us, and then instead of taking us to C minor, it takes us to C major, and then we're in that key. And of course in C major, G7 is just the dominant, so it's also well defined. So it's in both keys in that way. Another option for understanding this, and I've met people who talked about it like that, is that they think that D flat major is the pivot chord. So D flat is the chord that's in both keys. And of course in A flat, the D flat major is the 4th degree, and in C it's the Neapolitan subdominant, so it's the flat 2. And maybe just to talk a little bit about what the difference is between those 2 interpretations, because actually they kind of do have a slight difference in how that means that you will play that. If you think of the pivot chord as being G7, then it makes a lot more sense that you're playing it as if it's still in A flat major, and that means that it's resolving to C minor, and that means that you would be using C minor harmonic. So you're going to be playing a dominant with a flat 9 or a flat 13, and that sounds in my ears, the most smooth. That's why I say that that's the pivot chord. The other one, if you had D flat major as being the pivot chord, so then by the time you get to G7, you're actually already in C major. But that kind of means that then you will be using C major on that G7, and that means that you will be playing D flat major, and then you will go to C major, and that's sort of a very unclear interpretation of that. I think that's not the nicest way to play that transition. Usually, it's nicer to just have the dominant being altered, and then the resolution is the surprise, not the dominant. Because if you already play like G7 with a 9 and 13, then it's already clear that you're modulated. And somehow, to me at least, to my taste, I'm curious what you guys think. Maybe you don't agree with me. Then you can of course let me know in the comments. Then the modulation works better if you delay it until you actually get to the 1 chord, which is also what you're gonna see the most when you see these types of modulations up to the 3rd, but not all the time. Like Gone with the Wind doesn't do it like that. So there are examples of both things. It is, I guess, a matter of taste. But to me, the having the G7 as an altered, or at least one dominant from harmonic minor, makes more sense. So that's the one type of modulation. You can also see that Jerome Kern, who wrote the piece, thinks the same as me. And you can't see that on the G7, because there is just 3rd and 7 that's in the melody. And actually I should say 7 and 3rd. But you can see that when we get to the 2nd A, because the 2nd A is in E flat, but it does exactly the same, so it goes from E flat to G major. And here, the melody on the D7, when we are in the modulation, has a flat 9. So there it really would be going against the melody to play a natural 9 also. And I guess that's like why I say, like, I think Jerome Kern would hear it the same as what I do. Otherwise, he would probably have done that melody. So much for that modulation. Then the next modulation we have when we're on C major, going to C minor into E flat, is really just using the fact that you can, of course, if you're in a key, it makes sense that once you're on the 1 chord, you can use the C minor as a pivot chord here, because if we can hear that something is in C major, then C minor is an accepted chord in there. There are pieces that will have both major and minor progressions on the tonic. So that's the chord then, that's the pivot chord. So in this case, I can actually fill it in. So this is 1 minor. If you analyze this, sometimes you will just write them on top of each other. 1 minor in C major, and then in E flat major, it's actually the 6. So that's the chord, the pivot chord that is in both keys. So then we actually have had all of those, and as I just said, the modulation to G major is completely the same. D7 is the pivot chord. Then it stays in G major, so we get to 2-5, and then the modulation to E major is again using this idea that we have a cadence to something that we're thinking is a 6th degree. We're expecting minor, and then it turns out to be a 1 chord, and that means that actually that whole cadence, the F sharp, well, it's written as an F sharp minor 7 here, but it should be a minor 7 sharp 5. Is a cadence that's helping us modulate, and we're expecting E minor, but then it's actually modulating, and you can hear when it resolves to E major, like, oh, we're in another key. That's kind of how that works. The final modulation, where we're in the bridge and then going back to the F minor in the last A, is probably the one that's the least obvious, because the other ones are using sort of fairly common ways of modulating. Also, like when you're moving from a 1 chord to a 1 minor chord, is similar to what you'll come across in Solar or How High the Moon. So that's a fairly common way of having modulations like this. But in the end of the bridge, we have the E major turning into a C7, which is really, like the way I explained it now, is I think the C7 is probably going to be the pivot chord. So the E major is the tonic, and then we get the C7, which is then the tritone substitution of the dominant. So that's a tritone substitution for the F sharp 7. and then that should take us to a B7, but it takes us to F minor. I think that's the best way of explaining that, and it's also kind of just coming out of changing that one note in the chord. And then in the last A part we don't have any modulations at all, so that's fairly simple. So in terms of modulations, then that is how that works. And also what you want to do if you want to understand the modulation is really to look at what is the pivot chord. And as you can probably also see here is that whenever there's a modulation, then you really get the idea that we're moving to another key. You can clearly hear it. So at the end of the last A, where we get some quite a lot of different chords, but there's no real feeling of moving to another key. So in that way, there's not really a modulation. That's also something that can be a little bit tricky to understand. That actually pieces that have a lot of different chords will still not modulate. Again, my analysis of Stella by Starlight is a great example of this, because that song is like all over the place, but maybe only modulates once really, but borrows chords left and right and uses all sorts of tricks to come up with different sounds and different harmony. So that's also worthwhile thinking about. The main reason that I can keep on publishing videos every week is that I have a community of people that are supporting my channel over on Patreon. I'm very grateful for that, and if you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. There's a link in the description. If you join us over on Patreon, then I can also give you something in return for your support. With the scales that you can use to improvise over this, of course, there are a ton of options in terms of just reinterpreting them and adding things to the changes, because the progression is fairly simple, but at the same time, what is really just there is probably what you need to work on mostly, and that's straightforward, I think. So for the A part, F minor, B flat, E flat 7, A flat, and D flat are all just in the key of A flat major, and that means that that's the scale you need to use on them. Of course, you still need to like play the harmony. But the fact that when you're listening to this, if you're improvising on this song and you know the melody, then you already really have the sound of the harmony in your ears. That's sort of one of the advantages for this song, I think. And that's also why, even though it's in many ways more difficult than a lot of other songs because it modulates so much, it's actually a really nice song for a less experienced improviser, because you can really also just rely on hearing the melody, and when you play something which is strong in the harmony, like the third usually is, then you can connect both to the melody and to the harmony, and keep your place and play something that makes sense, hopefully. So for the rest, there's really no real mystery to it. I think that's what's going on. It has a few sort of quirks in the sense that usually it's turned around, which is nice, but also fairly uncommon, I think, where we're starting on the 6th degree and then the 2, and then we get the 5 and the 1, and that means that the resolution to the 1, so the first basic cadence that actually resolves, is on a weak bar, because the 4th bar is a weak bar. You would expect it to be on the 3rd bar, similar to how you hear it in the bridge. That's where the cadences, the strong cadences, are going to resolve. But it's kept a little bit vague here, but there's another reason for that. Maybe I'll try and get a little back to that a little bit later. So that covers the first one. Then we get the G7, and of course I already talked about that. Also, it's a pivot chord, and we expect to hear, if you hear it from we're in A flat and this is a G7, then we expect it to be sort of a C minor harmonic scale sound, so a G7, flat 9, flat 13, that type of sound resolving, and then it resolves to C major, and here we really also just expect to hear C major, and you can make a nice trick if you use Lydian on it, but which is not what you really expect to hear there. But if you do use Lydian and really get that flat 5 in there, or the sharp 11 in there, then you have this nice thing of moving down a half step, and then you move the whole chord down, and then you have the C minor 11 in the next chord, which is something I use quite a lot. I think that is a nice transition, but it's not It's maybe not the most clear transition, it's a little bit more of a trick. Yeah, then we get the second A part, and that's again completely the same. Everything is in E flat, so it's just 6, 2, 5, 1, 4, and then we get dominant to 3. So 3 is of course a minor chord, and that means that we're expecting to hear D7 from G harmonic minor, which is also what you hear in the melody, and then resolving to major. Then the bridge, 2, 5, 1 in G, that's all in G. It's interesting with the melody here that actually, like, there's a flat 9 in the melody on the D7, but it's a leading note. So it's actually like a D sharp moving up to an E, and the E is the melody note. That's on the strong beat. So the melody doesn't suggest a flat 9, but of course it's a cadence. So once you play a 2, 5, 1, you can alter the dominance. Now we're used to that probably anyway. Then we get the cadence to, so the F sharp half diminished, which again in the real book version that I'm using here, it's written out as an F sharp minor 7. But I think the smooth way to do this, and also probably the way it's written, I have to actually check with a Jerome Kern version, but I'm pretty sure it's an F sharp half diminished. And then that's just a straight minor cadence, and we expect E minor and we get E major. C7, so the C7 here is resolving to F minor, and that means that you would expect to hear F harmonic minor on it. That will be the obvious scale choice. And then we're back in the last A. So the last A, again, 6, 2, 5, 1, 4, all A flat major sounds. Then we get the chord, so it's written as D flat minor 7, and I would say it's a D flat minor 6. That makes more sense in the key here. And I would play that as a melodic minor sound, so really like D flat melodic minor, and then moving to C minor 7. So C minor 7 is a 3rd degree, so I would use A flat major 7 on this, or A flat major scale. That's the sound that I think is there. And one sort of common trick to do with the next chord, because that's a flat 3 diminished, is to turn that into a minor chord, so really like this. And if you listen to players like, I think especially Keith Jarrett does this really a lot, but I've heard Kurt Rosenberg do it as well. If they want to do the C minor and then turn the dim chord into a minor chord, then they'll kind of announce it by playing the C minor chord, because they're kind of announcing the parallel movement. They'll play this as a Dorian, so that we really do have parallel chords moving, so we really get really just the same scale sound moving down half steps, and then they're back on the 2 chord. And that's, I guess it's kind of thinking ahead and saying, well, I'm making a parallel movement that's going to resolve. It's not a dominant, it's really parallel harmony, and I'm making that, and it's going to resolve on the 2 chord, and that means that I'm going to use the same sound on those chords all the way, and in that way using Dorian for all of them. I think that's the most common way to do that, but that's not what's in the melody, obviously. So that was just, I would say, when you're normally just playing on a 3 chord in major, you would think of it as a tonic chord. So really the way you hear it, and that's why it's useful to think in functions, I think, also because you hear, and then really this, even though it's the way we're playing it like this, because you don't hear it, if you're thinking in modes and you're hearing this as a Phrygian chord, then that's a Phrygian chord. So that would be the Phrygian sound, and we don't really hear that type of sound. We hear a minor chord, and the description of what we're hearing is more tonic, so more thinking A flat. So the B diminished, because the dim chords are always funny, and but in this case, if you take an A flat major scale, so A flat, B flat, C, D flat, E flat, F, G, and A flat, and I need to fit in a B diminished here, then there are 2 ways you can do it that will really make sense. But think the easiest one to do is just to say, well, I'm just going to take my B flat is going to be turned into a B. So my D flat is going to be turned into a D. So, and then I have all the notes in there. If I look at this scale, the way I'm playing it, I'm playing it from A flat, but really the scale that I end up with in this case is a C harmonic minor scale. So that's the scale that's easy to work with. The other option would be, what's it called, E flat harmonic major, which is sort of a variation on it. There's like one note difference. And then we have the final 2/5, back to the tonic, and then here it's written down with a cadence that's like G7 to C7. And of course you can do that. You can also just use G half diminished to C7 or just a C7. Or there are a lot of different options there. And I guess one thing, because I just briefly touched upon it, but I do think it's worth mentioning. If you check out the original version of this, as far as I know, the beginning is with triads and not with complete extended chords. And the reason why that's, I mean, it's not directly relevant, but I think it's just a nice point to understand why. Because, as I said, we have this cadence that's resolving in a weak bar to the key of the song, and that is a little bit strange. But in this case, I think also what Jerome Kern is doing here is that he's actually using the triads and then kind of disguising what key we're in. So first we just hear, okay, we're in F minor, because we hear F minor triad. We go to the 4th degree, because that's B flat minor. And then you get the E flat 7. And then then you might start to suspect, well, maybe I'm not in F minor. Oh, I'm in A flat. So you kind of get this, and then we go to D flat, and then the G7, and then we're in C. So in that way, there's like an extra layer of subtle modulations happening in the song. And when we play jazz, we don't have that, because the way that we usually would treat a tonic minor chord is to turn it into a minor 6 chord. But as soon as you do that, then it's not ambiguous at all. Then you can hear, this is the tonic. And then later we will really get a sort of a modulation. But if you play it with triads, then there's room for being vague, and you can sort of get that nuance of a modulation in there as well. And we just lose that. And usually what most people, at least, it's not that I've transcribed a lot of different solos and all things you are, but I don't think I've heard people use melodic minor on that first chord. Again, if you have a solo where they do that, then let me know. I think that would be interesting, actually. If you want to check out some more videos where I'm analyzing standards so that you can have a better idea about how you can analyze progressions for yourself and understand the different functions and how the different chords work, then check out one of these videos where I'm analyzing All of Me and Stella by Starlight. If this is the first time you see one of my videos and you want to learn more about jazz guitar, then subscribe to my channel. And if you want to help me keep making videos, then check out my Patreon page. That's about it for this week. Thank you for watching, and until next week.